Jerusalem.
They ran away from Yafa. They went to East Jerusalem.
Okay, so they escaped from Yafa to East Jerusalem.
Correct.
So
They
when
had
they
family there.
so when they settled in East Jerusalem, they were already refugees from Yafa, Tel Aviv. Now they were already in East Jerusalem as sort of refugees. I have been looking for Palestinian voices to express what a Palestinian Canadian is going through. And I've recorded 3 episodes so far, and the majority of speakers were Jewish Canadians. So it was very interesting that it was not easy to find a Palestinian voice to speak because there's worry. Yes, I have opinions, but I don't want to say them publicly. Can I hide my name and my face? And I offered all that to people, and there were a couple of people who say no. And tonight, I am happy to say that I finally found a Palestinian Canadian who was willing and brave enough to come and talk about a Palestinian experience in Canada. With me today is Yafa. And Yafa, can you please introduce yourself, your name, and tell us your origin story? How did Yafa become Canadian Palestinian? How does somebody become a Canadian Palestinian?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Ahmed, and marhabtain to you and to everybody watching.
That's
like,
hello for the non-Arabic speaker.
Yeah, hello. It's like a
It's like
double
it's like
hello.
that double hello.
Double hello. Like two hellos.
Yeah, 2 hellos in one.
So yeah, I was born in Toronto, Canada. My parents both are Palestinian. So
You were born in Toronto.
Mazbout.
This is very rare. You're like the 3rd person that I know that I met that is born in Toronto.
I'm very lucky. But also, I don't know, like I always say that because sometimes I feel like, does it disqualify me from having an opinion? But I say that also just to like recognize my privilege. Like I was born into the Canadian passport, which is enormous privilege. Before I give you my origin story, I will explain myself in like one sentence. So when I make eggs for myself, I must have 3 things. I need to have a specific good quality olive oil, but it's usually like a no-name brand because we have to find olive oil from Palestine. And it's like my parents will bring them in these huge containers. We all like pour them all into different ones because we really want to make sure we're supporting farmers. The other thing I really need when I make my eggs is za'atar. So I sprinkle a little za'atar. And then the other thing I really need is ketchup. I need ketchup to eat my eggs.
So olive oil, for most of people who don't know, is like the national product of Palestine and Palestinians out of olive trees.
Yes.
It's the national harvest, I guess. Za'atar is this very hard to explain spice. You cannot explain za'atar, but it is a spice that is a mix of things.
It's basically it's close to thyme or oregano.
Yeah,
dried,
thyme and oregano
and mixed with sesame, toasted sesame, mixed with sumac. Actually, my grandmother still makes hers from scratch. She like
so it's a very interesting from the old Levant, which extends Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and then we're not going to discuss the culture.
But this tells you everything you need to know about me, right? Because I think, like people see Canadians putting ketchup on mac and cheese and they're like, oh, like what's wrong with you? But I'm like, that is how Canadian I am, that I must eat ketchup when I eat eggs. But
okay, so now I get it. So the ketchup is the Canadian.
It's the Canadian. It's like I'm born here. And I feel like I'm 100% Canadian and I'm also 100% Palestinian. I'm not half and half.
Okay, it's good.
Like I can sing every word in like a Garth Brooks song or a Tragically Hip song. I also sing every word of like Feiruz, and I also sing every word of Cardinal Official because I'm from Toronto. Like I grew up with like hip hop and country, and Kulthum, and like all of this stuff was part of my
So what
upbringing.
does it mean to be a Palestinian born in Toronto? Like how did you identify? What did your parents tell you about their life? How did they come to Toronto? What's their story?
Okay, I'll give you their origin story. I'll tell you how they came to Toronto, and then I'll tell you how their parents kind of immigrated. But my father my father was born May 1948, so he's literally the age. He is 76 years old. Okay, so
Wow.
he fast forward. He came to Canada in 1970. Actually, maybe I should start with my grandparents. Should I start with my grandparents? Is that easier to do?
Yeah, yeah.
Because then I don't have to like backtrack. Okay, you can edit out all that stuff if you want. My both sets of my grandparents were from Yafa originally, and parts of Yafa, some that are still Yafa, and some that are now Tel Aviv. They were both what I was told prominent families. So they had businesses, they had land. My father's grandfather, Yafa Sakkejha, was buying lots of land, lots of land. We still have the deeds, like probably about 50 acres, I think, from what the deeds that we still have. And we've actually Google mapped it and found like these orange orchards that he used to have with employees and equipment. And they were shipping like hundreds of thousands of oranges in crates to Europe of Jaffa oranges. Now they're like soccer fields or, plazas, like stores and all that stuff. So, we look at the deeds just to kind of be like, it's symbolically very nice for us. At the same time, I'm in Toronto. I'm not going to go and like kick people out of their plazas, like living
So these
in
were
those
deeds
places.
issued by the
British,
British authority
British,
that took over British mandated Palestine from the
correct.
Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And they were just buying land. Like they
Yeah.
just wanted to like consolidate their businesses. And my mother's family were more, I guess they were a mix. Like some were political in some sense. Like some had some sort of, I guess, stature with the Ottomans. Like I can't remember the titles. Maybe Pasha. Maybe Pasha's too high. But like I don't know, different levels of like local
Yeah.
municipal organizing,
Okay.
and then also banking. So my grandfather was manager of a bank. So in 1948, we have two stories of my family. One is my father's family, the Sakkejha family, wanted to preemptively leave because they heard there was a lot of violence and attacks on Palestinians happening in Haifa in the north. So since Yafa's in the south, they thought we better leave. And the biggest thing wasn't necessarily like loss of land. Trigger warning. The biggest thing for my grandparents was like they didn't want their girls to be raped because there was a large amount of fear of that, except with our culture, people don't go, it's such a shameful thing in our culture that people don't go saying, hey, I was raped. Like, it's like something that you hide and you're bury. But there were still some stories of this. And so my grandmother, my grandmother, by the way, is like 95. She's still alive. She's still making za'atar with her hands. Okay. So she would have been a teenager pregnant with my father. And they had so much privilege because they were like elites and business owners that they had enough money and wherewithal to like know, hey, let's like fly out of here. They bribed a plane in Lud Airport, which I don't think Lud Airport even exists anymore. And it's because some like uncle, I can't remember who it was like, you better get out of here. And they had enough cash in the house at that moment in time, like May 15th, I guess, or May 14th, something like this. Where they just got on a mail plane that was taking the mail to Cairo. And my father was born 2 weeks later. He was born very small, 5 pounds. And like, that's their story. So when I hear people talk about the Nakba and they're like, we were expelled, or no, you left by yourselves. I'm like, I actually have both sides of my history. Like my father's family left because they were like, let's just leave. Like, we don't want to have any violence and we'll come back in a couple weeks. My mother's family, they had villa on the beach. And so their eyewitness accounts was that there was incoming gunfire coming from what we interpret today to be the Haganah. But back then it was just like armed militia that seemed to like how are people armed and where are they coming from? And so my grandmother has eyewitness history of like being in her beach villa with 3 children under the age of 5, and like literally incoming gunfire, and a shell exploded near their house and shrapnel came in her head and her neck, and they evacuated because they had bloodshed. Like, so they ran. They went to Jerusalem where they had other
And
family.
just to frame this, sorry to interrupt you, just to frame this for anyone who's listening, you want to think of 1948. There is no internet, there is no evening news, there was no television service in the Middle East, barely any radio at that time. Maybe the BBC, the British Broadcasting, had some presence. There was the Cairo radio for sure. The news didn't fly very fast. Fear and rumors dominated everything. And there is war. And it's also, I think the 1948 war, for those who are not familiar with it, was a terrible one because it was a mix of regular war between armies, as Egyptian army and the Jordanian army, as what we call now Jordan, clashed with what was a mix, like you said, of organized militias.
Yeah, like
I think it was Haganah and
Ergun. Yeah, that's
air
what
guns,
my
right?
great.
And
Yeah,
but also it had it had some of what you would call a civil war, because a lot of the people who fought this war used to be neighbors just years prior.
absolutely.
So
Because
it
we
was
had.
a tough situation with not a lot of information.
It's true. Actually, my father's family report, like a lot of their team at the orchard were Jewish. They were refugees, and they were working side by side. And they remember them being like kind and really hardworking, really industrious. Of course, like you're a refugee leaving for your life, leaving ethnic cleansing in Europe, leaving the genocide of Europe of Jews. Like, so they really like understood that and recognized that. So I don't know. I mean, my father's family ended up going to Aman, Jordan, where we still have a lot of Sakkejha family there. And then my mother's family stayed in Jerusalem. My mother was born there, but because the families knew each other from Yafa, these families knew each other. Like when you say, "Oh, this family, that family," everyone's asking, "What's your last name?" Because they used to know each other, go to hotels and dance and go to weddings. So when my father was ready, I think, to get married, I wouldn't say it was an arranged marriage. It's more like they knew the family. They knew that she came
Yeah,
from a
yeah.
good family. They knew each other. There was no relation.
It was the 40s.
Yeah, I mean, my parents got married in the 80s, but
Oh, sorry, your parents met in the 80s. I'm sorry.
yes.
Okay,
No,
but
that's okay. My dad was
yeah.
born in the 40s. My mom was born in the 50s. And then just to skip over a little bit, like my father's father, Mamdouh Sakkejha, he lost everything. Like he was supposed to be a third generation wealthy landowner,
So
business
just before
owner.
we jump, you talked
Yes.
about your mother's side, I believe, that was still that stayed
Yes.
in Palestine,
Yes.
and these are the ones who were in Jerusalem or were also in
Correct.
Jaffa. They were in Jerusalem.
They ran away from Yafa. They went to East Jerusalem.
Okay, so they escaped from Jaffa to East Jerusalem.
Correct.
So
Because they
when
had family there. Yes.
when they settled in East Jerusalem, they were already refugees from Jaffa, Tel Aviv. Now they were
Correct.
already in East Jerusalem as sort of refugees escaping from.
Yes. Yes, but also they had family there. Like
Of
I
course.
probably would have like stayed in their grandparents'
Oh
house.
no,
And
I'm
then,
not saying, when I
yes.
say refugees, I'm not saying they were living in a tent. I'm just saying that
Yes. Yes.
this was not where they lived originally. They left their belongings and everything in on the other side, and when the war settled, they ended up being in East Jerusalem. And then your grandfather family, father's side,
Yes.
who escaped on the mail airplane to Cairo, ended up back in Amman. I'm guessing because they felt it is as close as possible.
Yeah, as close as possible. And I think, people were like getting into like any vehicle and just driving. And I
Yeah,
think a bunch of their family had ended up in Amen. And yeah, there was always this concept like it's just a couple weeks and then we'll go back. Like we left so much equipment there, like the trees, you can't pick up like 50 acres of trees and take them with you. But like that's your
of course,
livelihood.
of course.
Right.
And then that's eventually how your parents, they were born into this environment, into this weird, unsettled mayhem.
Yes.
And then they met.
They met. So really quickly, my both of those families insisted on everyone going to university, even the girls, especially the girls. They're like, you have to finish your school as much as possible, which I think was progressive back then. Like we're talking like the 60s. I mean, there were a lot of women, I think, going to university because the
I,
60s was
I
also a
read stats
revolutionary
that
time.
Palestinians have some of the highest rates in the
Yes.
world in higher education, even in the occupied territories. Like
No,
people
you're right.
really
Absolutely.
want to go to universities.
No, you're absolutely right. No, thank you for that catch because I think there was a lot of that happening even before the 60s. I mean, I have like pictures of my grandmother's sisters who were born in the 20s, like all graduating university and like standing there on graduation day in dresses, like holding their degrees. So, absolutely. Anyway, so my father ended up going to England for engineering, and then his father worked really hard. His father was a vendor, first started as a vendor at the farmers market because he knew agriculture and he thought, okay, I will like wholesale fruit. And I think his competitive advantage was because he had so much knowledge, he would go to farmers and front them seeds and also give them free knowledge because his family was in agriculture. He'd be like, you know what, when you're doing this, you're cultivating it, it'll get bigger and better if it's like this. And like giving away all this knowledge for free, giving away seeds for free. And because of that, he didn't use that to like gain leverage or like coerce them, but they end up being loyal to my grandfather, the farmers, that they would let him pick the best produce first. So he would come, pick the best stuff, take it to the farmer's market, sell it. That was his edge. And then he eventually, over his lifetime, ended up having a business with 30 employees, 6 trucks. He sent all 5 of his children to British or American universities, paying in pounds. And he had like, one suit that he owned. But for him, it was like Mohammed Theater. It was very important. Like all his kids finish Western universities and he pays for all the weddings. And he worked for that. So when my father ended up in England, I think as soon as my father got there and he realized like, wow, the West is so different. He didn't actually want to come back to the Middle East. He wanted to stay in the West and he was getting offers. He was getting job offers. He got a PhD offer from Rolls-Royce to continue working there. And he's like, I'm going to continue this. He probably fell in love with a British girl along the way. And his father was like, no, you need to come back. You need to come and like rebuild our people here. And that was really painful, I think, for his father to let go of his son. And so I think my dad being the firstborn male of the firstborn male of the firstborn male like he was like the first male, it was like so deeply painful that he chose to leave. And so he ended up coming to Canada because in the 70s, Canada was, I think, a lot more open to immigration. They accepted him. He came to Canada in 1970, 22 years old, $19 in his pocket. The story of him spending like $11 to take a cab from Pearson Airport to the immigration office downtown, where they gave him 5 TTC tokens and 5 Bell payphone tokens. And they gave him like, I think, enough money for like 1 room. And they're like, okay, you just got to come every day and like show us that you've got your resume and that you're going to try to get a job. And in order to get your next TTC token. So he only did that for a week. And then he was a nuclear engineer. Like he was able to like build and design nuclear power plants, but like nobody wanted to hire a Palestinian nuclear engineer in the 70s. And, he has not just one Muhammad in his name, he has 2 Muhammads in his name because like Muhammad Faiz, Muhammad Yafa Sakkejha, because it's like his father's name in between. So he ended up washing dishes in Yorkville in the 70s in Toronto. And so he soon didn't need those TTC tokens anymore. He went off of like this welfare type thing after a week. And
That's incredible.
it's crazy. It's crazy. So,
And then I'm assuming he went back to visit in Aman and then got to meet your mom
correct. Yeah.
in Jordan and then got married and came here.
I mean, he was single for a long time. I think he got married when he was 36, which is a long time. And my mother was, I think, in her late 20s. So they were both like getting married quite older back then, but they fell in love. They met each other. And my mom then moved in 1984. She left East Jerusalem, left her mother's house, and came to Toronto to live with my dad at this small, really dingy apartment in.
So your dad traveled to East Jerusalem in the 70s?
No, my dad has never been to Palestine. Like,
Okay.
nor I don't think he was allowed to. And to be honest, I don't know if he wants to. I think the pain is like too much. But no, they would meet in
So
Amman for
he
sure.
grew up with a story, but he has never been. He
Correct.
just knows it as a story. But
Yes.
your mother grew up in East Jerusalem.
Yeah, she lived it. She lived military curfews. She lived peaceful protests. She lived going to universities and getting shot at with like rubber bullets for trying to do peaceful protests. Like she grew up in a very different situation.
So she probably witnessed. She probably didn't witness the 48 war, but she witnessed the
Correct.
67. So she lived in East Jerusalem when it was under Jordanian
Occupation.
Arab control,
Yes.
and then after 67, it was occupied by Israel, and she lived under the occupation, and then she came to Canada after she married your dad.
Correct. She would have been 12 in 1967.
Do you go visit?
Yes. So actually, as soon as I turned one, my mom would visit. And I think it was mostly because, I'm born in 1985. It's the winter. My mom has come to this country, doesn't know anyone. She speaks English fluently, speaks French fluently, but I'm a mom. I have two kids. So I think about that first year postpartum, like you just want your village. And so she was just like, okay, I got to go to Jerusalem. And it didn't matter. Like, I don't know. We always would travel probably every 3 years, every 2 to 3 years growing up. We would go back and we'd go and stay in my grandmother's house, which then she had been in Ramallah at that time. So we used to go stay in her house, like sleep in this bed together, like everybody in one bed. My grandma had her own bed. Me and my sister, my mom would be in the other bed in a 2 bedroom little beautiful house
So
in Ramallah.
Ramallah is in the West Bank.
Correct.
And at that time, the West Bank, just to be clear, at that time, the West Bank and East Jerusalem were all just one big occupied family, like
This is a
happy
good
family.
question.
Because
Yeah.
right now, traveling from the East Jerusalem to Ramallah is not easy because Ramallah is now the Palestinian Authority control. But
Yes.
you're talking about the 70s or 80s, everything was just occupied territories.
Yeah, and very different. Like definitely as I grew up and got older, I noticed it gets physically more difficult to visit my grandma, to cross checkpoints, and then our family in East Jerusalem. Like it used to be driving from like here to not here to Mississauga, that's even too far. Like from downtown Toronto to maybe like uptown Toronto. It's like you just drive, you go back and forth, and then being a teenager and like going through all the interrogation at Ben Gurion, going through all the checkpoints, waiting in line, but I still had a Canadian passport, so it was like fast tracking us. But still, I grew up witnessing the change. And then I remember the wall going up. I remember seeing them construct the wall.
And it's very interesting. I hear that from a lot of people, even on the Jewish side, where it seems that it seems like we've gone through a couple of generational deterioration in the relationship from the neighbors who worked together and worked in fields and had farmers to a war to, all right, occupy territories, but people move freely inside, or not freely, but they move inside the occupied territories. And we still have an issue and we're working on it, into the wall,
Yes.
into now where like it is almost impossible to cross.
Yeah, it's very violating. It's a very violating experience. And it's a very different experience because my grandmother living in Ramallah would have grown up with a lot more freedom. And then my family that stayed in East Jerusalem, like a lot of my extended family, have almost the privilege and freedom of never the same as a full Israeli citizen, I would say, but definitely mobility, being able to like they just like walk to the old city, you walk to the mosque.
They have the freedom of
Right.
going to the mosque and the
They
old city.
do,
Yeah.
and they interact with Israelis a lot more where it's not militarized. I mean, I'm sure that there's still definitely a huge police presence, and there's a presence of like arms and weapons all the time.
Yeah.
But it's more isolating in Ramallah, definitely.
And then you grew up as a Palestinian and you've gone through some experiences in Toronto. So you were probably young when the second Intifada happened and the failed
Yes.
peace accord, the assassination of Isaac Rabin. Like what were your memories around these days,
I
if you remember
I
them?
have barely any memories. I just remember seeing like people on TV throwing rocks, and I was very young. I was born in 1985, so I would have been a young girl slash
So you're
maybe
at high
early
school
teen.
or
Yeah.
med school, but you didn't feel like this is something that touches you by any.
I always knew that we were different, um, but you know, it didn't swallow my identity the way it might swallow my identity now. Like growing up in Toronto, I went to just like a secular co-ed school. So I remember my best friend when I was 6 was this girl named Aviva. Aviva, if you're listening, I still adore you. Like this gorgeous girl, like beautiful curly red hair. Like we would stand next to each other in the playground and we would say, our names make a sentence. Beautiful spring, because Yafa means beautiful and Aviva means spring. And Yafa is a name in both Hebrew and Arabic, which means beautiful, and the city that we come from. So like that was just, I never overthought it, but I also kind of knew deep down that like being her friend was something important and something of a message and a statement, even as a little girl. And I can't explain how I received that message. I can't. But then, growing up with the Intifada, I think knowing how we were expelled from our land and knowing how our story was like not even the worst story, like all the Palestinians that we know were either forcibly expelled from their homes or chose to leave before they were expelled from their homes in terms of their own eyewitness history. And that was, again, you're talking like word of mouth, fear, no social media, like barely any organized news. So when you see men throwing rocks on TV, it didn't scare me. It didn't traumatize me. I think I was just maybe oblivious as a teenager as to like what was going on. You know what I
Okay.
mean?
Okay. So that's interesting, and I'm glad we've gone through this because I think origin stories have a lot to teach. I remember my first interaction with somebody who was a real Holocaust survivor,
Wow.
who was like Dutch, and that was 25 years ago in Toronto, and the gentleman was just the most pleasant person I ever met in my life, and he told me how he landed in Canada, how he came to Canada as a young boy, pretty much a young Dutch Jewish boy, not sure any of his family survived, and these stories are eye opening because they also form the generational stories a generation tells to generation, and Canada has been home to people who survived a lot of the world horrors. The Holocaust survivors, we have people who survived World War II horrors, we have people who survived Vietnam, Cambodian horrors, people who survived Somalis, Civil War horrors, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Croatia, the Balkan horror survivors, African from Sudan. Canada is somehow the place, the refuge that hosts a lot of people who come from trauma, and Palestinians are just one of these. And I may have probably forgot a couple of others. Like I know every time there is trauma around the world, Canada has always the capacity to open up and say we welcome people here. The latest of them probably would be the Syrian refugees.
Absolutely. And also, it's also interesting that we live on Turtle Island that belongs or was inhabited for 15,000 years by the Indigenous First Nations of Canada, the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Squamish-Lillooet, the Inuit people, the Mississaugas, the Algonquin, so many more peoples, the Micmac, the Métis. They are the original inhabitants and the indigenous of this land. And so I don't want to skip ahead too much, but I think growing up in Canada and learning the story of what happened to the First Nations in Canada, the residential schools, the slow genocide of what happened to them, like cutting their hair, the 60s scoop, like removing children from their parents, like all of that, you think, wow, my trauma does not even compare to that trauma. I mean, I don't think it's never fair to be like, oh, who has the most trauma? But growing up in Canada, you definitely, as a little girl, you just learned like, okay, the Inuit like eat whales and they live in igloos, and yeah, okay, next chapter, let's learn about like John A. McDonald. But then as a teenager and then growing up and going to university, and then I actually dated a man who was one quarter Cree and half Jewish. So interesting as a Palestinian Canadian to meet somebody Cree Jewish with his opinions about Israel and my opinions about Palestine. And then he was the one who exposed me. He took me to the what they called back then the Native American Symposium. I don't know if they use the word native much anymore compared to it, but I just remember seeing these grandparents like not able to speak. They just sat there silent. They were so, and I know in my family, the ones that are so mute because they've been through so much that they can't speak. And so I remember seeing this gentleman, his granddaughter was speaking on his behalf. And she was saying how she's teaching her grandfather their language. And they showed this whole movie about the residential school survivors. And I broke down crying. Everyone was crying in the room, except for my boyfriend at the time. He wasn't crying because he knew the story. And I was like, what? Is this real? And, you know, it takes years to realize, wait a minute, am I an Israeli settler to the Cree? Like, because they think, I don't know. I ask myself these questions, like the way my grandparents would have seen people now open a plaza on their land back home without purchasing that land. But it's like, oh, we had all these agreements and, you know, the agreements are all, just don't worry about it. We all agreed. We didn't need your individual consent. It's in the agreement. Don't worry about it. And then now I'm like, oh yeah, we built all these businesses in Canada. Oh my God, wait, what have I done? Like, I'm just, so you're right. Like, I think it's such an important thing to hold all of this in our hearts at the same time and recognize that we are settlers in Turtle Island and we live on stolen land and I open businesses on stolen land and I have different rights that the First Nations do not have here. It's
No,
an
I
apartheid
totally
system
agree.
in Canada
It
too,
is,
right?
it is a very complex topic,
It
and I
is.
think a big part of the complexity that comes with it, if I can have an opinion on that, is that we're also we evolved as humans into, I'm hoping, something better. So, like, we don't discuss slavery anymore. That was a discussion 150 years ago. We don't discuss racism. That was also a discussion. We don't discuss, like, there are a lot of things that we don't discuss anymore, like women rights and things like that. And luckily, like, we at least in the majority, in a good part of the world, we moved on, like, you know, with the LGBTQ rights and stuff. Some parts are still catching up. But we evolved and we continue to evolve. And I think it's always an interesting situation where we look back in anger somehow. We look back into our history and we judge it with our current modern standards. And we come out with really interesting conclusions. So I'm always careful with that argument. I am not, I totally think it is a valid, it's an important line of thought that we all should have to look critically in the past, without passing too much judgment though, because like the past, like some of the greatest men of the 60s had horrible opinions of women, and some of the best leaders of the early 20th century were very racist towards others, and some of the best leaders of the 18th and 19th century had slaves. It's like, it's for me, it is really interesting, and I'm always worried about the past. I don't know if you know, one of my friends, Jenny, she said, we don't choose our history, but we choose what to do with it. And I think something like Truth and Reconciliation in Canada is definitely a great example of, we didn't choose that history. None of us did. Not us, not the Mississaugas, not the Anishinabes, not Canadian Aboriginals. None of us chose that history. But we have a choice in how to deal with it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one thing I will add to that is like, I think we're still talking about rights of races and women and LGBT, but I agree with you that we're maybe further along on the spectrum than we used to be. I do
Oh,
agree
of course.
100% that we have to recognize our history and move forward. I just wanted to address like the whole Canada, Indigenous, Turtle Island, Palestinian dichotomy and think, well, if I'm going to be kind with my parents who are refugees, I'm like, well, they didn't know what happened. They didn't know that people traded all of their lands for a few pots and pans because they didn't understand what they were signing. Like, but then how can I not then hold that same compassion for the Israeli babies that are being born on the land today? Because they didn't choose, they didn't know. Do you see what I'm saying?
Exactly, and that's the point. And I think
Yeah.
I think I think this is now we're opening like a totally different discussion, which is
We
how
just
to deal
went
with
there.
history, and
Yeah.
and I think this is good, and we can have one day a discussion. Like maybe we should have a discussion on how to deal with complicated history, and failure to deal with complicated history leads to you know, Milosevic in Serbia, who was quoting 700-year-old prince launching a civil war in his country because for 700 years they failed to deal with their history. It's a painful discussion. People need to have that discussion. So I think Yafa, this is really good introduction, and I am glad that we actually started this. And I think for the second half, we should reflect on how did the latest events affect you as a Palestinian Canadian.